Do you ever think about how the Titanic is like still down there?
You can't control fate. You can't control the outcome because, nature will always win.
I find that very peculiar. Why didn't they put enough lifeboats for people?
That's the point. You know how it ends.
Oh, was Jack just a player and he wasn't gonna stay with Rose once they got out and she just throws it up? Did that ever bother you? Welcome to our discussion today. I'm Rachel Schneider, and with me is Jocelyn Groll, a certified Titanic expert and historian. And today we will be talking about the actual unsinkable ship as well as the 1997 film adaptation. So Josie, without further ado, what got you so interested in Titanic in the first place?
Well, Rachel, I was 7 years old when my teacher brought in those Scholastic magazines that we kind of used to read in elementary school. And it was in April, and it was just kind of talking about the ship itself, the sinking of it, the rediscovery of it. And I was just hooked. From then on, I was checking out books in the library. I was watching any documentary I could get my hands on. I was doing research papers on it. I just was completely obsessed.
In second grade?
In second
you were
grade.
Doing research papers?
Well, throughout elementary school after that, yeah, in the years after.
And I didn't really know a whole lot about it before I saw Jack and Rose, and I was convinced that that was a true story for a very long time. But what got you so fascinated about it?
Honestly, I have no idea. I was really nerdy when I was little, so for me, it was the actual event of it, how this, catastrophic event could really impact the naval laws, international naval laws, how so many people died, and the way that it worked where, the richer people survived at a higher percentage than poor people. And I was just so fascinated by all the little details of it, from how it was built to how the wreck was discovered to every conspiracy theory in between. And it just kept growing as I got older, and my parents thought eventually I would grow out of it, and I just never did.
Well, I'm glad that you didn't. Because, like I mentioned before, I have a lot of questions concerning the Titanic. Because not only the movie sparks controversy, but as you said, the little details that it points out about the politics and the social norms of that day, even what went into building the ship. It's just, it is fascinating just to think about, well, number one, how this discussion got started is, do you ever think about how the Titanic is like still down there?
Yeah, I do.
It's been there. And it's been over 100 years since, when did it sink?
1912.
1912. Okay. Were there ever discussions about them bringing it up?
Yeah. There's actually a movie called Raising the Titanic that's all about the theory of bringing it back and putting it in a museum. But a lot of the theories, so in 1912, obviously didn't have submarines. The Titanic itself is about 2.2 miles under the ocean. So there was no kind of way to access it. So when it went down until 1985, I believe, there's just no idea what happened to it. There were some records, especially during the trials afterward, where people were talking about it breaking in half and them seeing it kind of snap in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of why it was a theory even before Robert Ballard and his crew found the wreck.
So they didn't actually find it until the 80s? Or
80s,
Oh, I didn't know that. Because I figured once they'd found, the people in the boats, they're like, oh, it must be right down there.
No, it's 2.5 miles under the ocean. There's no there's no light. So there's no way to find it without, in the movie, how they're talking about the 9-inch glass. And yeah, you have to have that kind of technology. So what happened was, and kind of in the movie, they give the little description of.
Right, and kind of, Bob's there. And
Yep.
Then,
So
I
it's
remember that part.
Yeah, so the angles and all that kind of stuff wasn't quite extreme, but the process of it was very similar. So you're seeing it go down by the head, which is why you can kind of see in this picture, it's so much deeper there because it came down.
Like it crashed.
Yes. So it comes down head first, it hits the bottom and lands, which is why it kind of collapses toward the middle. But because it's such a big ship, when it filled and it kind of got to its breaking point, it snapped in half, but it's not going to be totally sticking straight up like it is in the movie.
When did plans for the movie begin?
I want to say 3 to 4 years before the actual premiere of it. So James Cameron had this vision that he wanted to go see the Titanic. He's a historian, he's an explorer.
Before he even directed movies, he was a
He's
historian.
both. I mean,
Just,
he,
like,
yeah,
really-
he's
okay.
just like a, what do they call, Renaissance man of like
Yeah.
the 90s.
I like a Renaissance man.
Yeah, so he's explored all over the ocean, done all kinds of dives for all different kinds of things. But one thing that always really interested him was the Titanic, and he wanted to go down and dive to the ship. So he wrote the script for the movie to get Fox to pay for him to go down to the ship.
That's a lot of money. As far as the movie, when did you see that? Because I know we've watched it just ourselves at least twice on a wine night.
The first time I saw it, I was 5. So I was living in Blissfield, and I remember my parents kind of sending me out for like the scary or inappropriate scenes. But I was really fascinated by it. And then I didn't watch it again until after I actually knew what the Titanic was. And then I started like remembering seeing all these scenes, and my parents were like, yeah, like you've seen this movie before. And now it's my grandma and my favorite movie. We watch it every time I go to her house. So I've probably seen it like 75 or 80 times at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really didn't know much of anything about the Titanic until I'd seen the movie, and it was with my grandma, you know, staying at her house on weekends, and we'd watch this and Gone with the Wind. But I remember we had the VHS version.
Yep,
and the
I've got
movie
the
is so long that you have to take out one VHS and put in the other to see the rest of the movie. But the movie, from the very first time I saw it, it frustrated me because I just had so many questions, and the characters frustrated me. And you know, the whole thing with the ship and how they didn't have enough of the lifeboats to save everyone frustrated me, and how, you know, all the poor people and the Irish people and the foreign people were at the bottom of the ship and they wouldn't let them up through the gates frustrated me. So there's a lot of things that, like you mentioned at the beginning, it's just, you know, as a kid you're like, why do they do that? Because you don't know politics or anything yet. You're just like, they're gonna die. Why are they doing that? So from the beginning, when they were making the ship, why didn't they put enough lifeboats for people?
That wasn't maritime law at the time. So in 1912, when Harlan and Wolff were, or I guess earlier, prior to 1912, when Harlan and Wolff were building these new Olympic class liners, so the Titanic, Olympic, and then their other sister ship, they didn't have to have enough lifeboats for everyone because it just wasn't the priority. It was, you know, they had to have a certain number of lifeboats. And Titanic actually went over that, I think, by maybe like 4 lifeboats. And then they also had the collapsible ones to make more room on the deck. But these were luxury liners, and at the time they didn't want to clutter the decks for the first class and even kind of second class people with these extra lifeboats when they called this the unsinkable ship. I mean, it had the double hull, which was really unique for the time.
What did that do? What did they do that made them think this is unsinkable? This is not going down.
So part of it was, I mean, there's millions of rivets holding, you know, the steel hull together. They had the double hull, which basically is like one layer of the ship's bottom and then another layer on top of it for like double protection. And then they had the watertight doors, which you can see in the sinking scenes of Titanic when they're shutting. So I think with Titanic, it was you could have 4 fill up and you could still stay afloat, and they had obviously more than that because it was a slice along the side by the iceberg. But with that, it was this massive ship. You know, they're like, nothing can really take this down. Why do we need to clutter our decks with the lifeboats? And then you'll see after that shipwreck, because so many people died as a result of the lack of lifeboats, international maritime law was passed to require that all ships have enough lifeboats for every passenger on board.
And that's not the only law that was changed after this happened, because I believe when I took a communication media law class, there was a certain radio law that was changed.
Yeah. So at the time, as you know, or as you can see in the movie, ships were communicating by Morse code. So Titanic was one of the first ships to actually use SOS as a distress signal. Before that was CQD. And with that, ships didn't have to leave their kind of signal, I don't really know the exact word, but they didn't have to be available 24/7.
Okay.
They could go to bed, sign off, which is why the Californian, which was a ship that was really close to Titanic at the time, and kind of the ship that you can see in the distance in the movie when they like are shooting up the distress signals because they're trying to get it, trying to get its attention. It was that close, but because they had gone to bed for the night, or their person on Morse code had gone to bed for the night, they didn't get any of the messages until the morning. Versus the Carpathia, which was 4.5 hours away.
Right.
They did have it on still, and they came, but it was too late by the time they got there. So after that, the law was also changed that you have to stay you have to have someone available to receive any kind of distress signals 24 hours a day.
Okay. And with the lower class people not being able to get up the stairs, they were literally shut out.
That's a movie thing.
That was a completely a movie thing?
So from what I've seen and what I've heard, it wasn't this kind of dramatizing what happened. The gates might have been down, but they weren't locked, from what I've been seeing. But they were saying the real issue of getting third-class people up to the decks to get to the lifeboats was a language barrier.
Really?
A lot of them didn't speak English or they couldn't read. And so they couldn't follow the signs to get to the certain staircases to get up to the top of the deck.
Oh my gosh. See that? And they never explain that in the movie at all. They just, they literally show these officers like holding the gate shut, like, no, you can't come up.
And I don't know if that's like 100% true. It's just something that I have seen and read in some of the research I've done. But yeah, that's what they're saying is, they had the gates down, but they most likely weren't locked. And then from there was just like a big language barrier or a lack of literacy to follow the signs to get to the decks.
And being that, as you said, a majority of the deaths resulted in the fact that they didn't have enough lifeboats. But what started the ship sinking in the first place, of course, was the iceberg.
Yep.
And that's also been a controversy of like, okay, whose fault was it? Like, who should have seen this iceberg? Could they have gotten away from it, even if they saw it? What, in your research, what do you think about that?
One of the kind of more conspiracy-based documentaries that I've seen was looking at how that particular area of the Atlantic is kind of notorious for mirages. So the same way you'd be in like a desert and you kind of see like the mirage, or if you're kind of on like a flat bit of road and it kind of looks like there's puddles. This kind of area was notorious, at least for like, I want to say it's like the Netherlands is the closest kind of area of land for fishermen to go out to this area, and the mirage would kind of make the ocean look from here to there. So it kind of raises the water line, which would kind of block out the iceberg, which would make it possible for them to not see an iceberg that they should have seen with plenty of time to turn until it was too late. So that's just one of the conspiracies I've seen. Another one was kind of focusing on how the rudder was just too small. So you have this massive ship, and although you have these giant propellers, they're still huge.
Yeah, they were huge.
But they were still too small to turn the ship at the speed that like a more proportionate ship would have. So that's another thing. There's numerous theories about why it wasn't seen and whose fault it was. I've seen one thing where they were trying to see if there was like faulty metal holding the ship together. Like, why did it rip so easily? Why, the movie kind of shows like the rivets popping off as the iceberg tears through the hull. And I've seen kind of like a Mythbusters-esque show where they are recreating the exact kind of rivets the same way that they would have created them for Harlan de Wolf.
Right.
And they're showing it under a pressure test, and they're just bending it completely. The rivets aren't going anywhere. Maybe like one or two popped out of this giant piece of steel that they were testing. The steel wasn't ripping. And they kind of concluded that this was because there was a theory that they were using really cheap metal to build this liner to save money in the long run. And they were kind of leaning more toward, after doing the experiment, that no, they were using the highest class of steel that they could get.
Right.
It's just the reality that the iceberg was stronger. In April, typically you aren't having the number of icebergs that they were having in that year, but from a lot of other ships, you were seeing a lot of iceberg notices in that area around that time.
So they did know.
They had an idea that it was going to be kind of an ice field. And I think you can kind of see that in the movie when the sun comes up. You can kind of see there's icebergs just all around them, if I'm not mistaken. But then you have J. Bruce Ismay, who is trying to not only have the largest ship in the world, the grandest ship in the world, but he wants the fastest ship in the world. So he was really pushing E.J. Smith to go faster, light the last boilers, come in within, because at that time, going across the ocean in a week was unheard of. It had been almost accomplished, but he was like, well, why not? Why don't we show up a day early and kind of surprise everyone?
And it's not just the history of it that frustrates me, but the movie greatly does, for multiple reasons. And one of those things is just even as a kid, I could never understand why, number one, okay, Rose at the end, spoiler alert, throws what was it called?
The heart of the ocean.
The heart of the ocean, this blue, beautiful, big diamond necklace that the people have been looking for essentially the entire movie. That's why they brought her on the ship, is like, okay, where does she think this necklace is? And she just throws it off. Did that ever bother you? Or does it, I mean, and leading into that as well, was that necklace based on a real thing?
So I guess the first couple times I watched it, I was pretty upset. And then the more I watched it, I kind of realized that for her, the necklace was more symbolic for her. It symbolized this crazy roller coaster of a week that she had from, getting engaged with Cal and moving onto the ship and having the relationship with Jack and kind of totally leaving her first class life behind.
Right.
For her, there was more, and it's kind of the same lesson she's trying to teach the crew on that ship, is that this isn't a treasure hunt. It's not a number of statistics. It's not this history lesson in the textbooks. It's a thing that really happened to real people. And for her, I think the necklace more symbolized the event than like actually just being an artifact of the ship, which is why, at least in my opinion, I think she throws it off. And it's not based on any kind of like story necklace.
Right.
However, it is like physically based off of, I want to say the Hope Diamond.
The Hope Diamond. Is that also blue?
Yeah.
I don't know my diamonds.
It's in the Smithsonian, and I can't remember exactly which one it is, but they're almost identical.
Really? Okay. Yeah, so that part always frustrated me, and then I know this gets more into like psychological or but when Rose dies, okay, she dies, and obviously she's had children, grandchildren, because she goes on the ship with her granddaughter, and she tells her granddaughter, I never even told Jack to your grandfather.
Yeah.
I never told anyone about this. I find that very peculiar because, I mean, when she dies, she goes to be with Jack.
Yeah.
So her husband is just like somewhere in heaven waiting around for her that she spent most of her life with. Did that ever frustrate you?
Honestly, it really didn't. Just because, or not so much like the ending, I don't know. The ending I just never really thought much about.
Yeah.
But the idea that she never told anyone probably isn't all that uncommon.
Really?
Because you'll see a lot of survivor stories where, the only reason we know they're survivors are because their name is on a passenger list. But they never talk about it. They never talk about it with their kids. They never talk about it with their husbands and wives. They never.
That they were a passenger on the Titanic? How would that not come up? If you're like on a first date, they say, hey, how'd you get to America? Oh, the Titanic.
Back in 1912 and the subsequent years, there was no diagnosis of PTSD.
Really?
So a lot of people left the sinking with what kind of today we would call PTSD. And there's been a couple of books written on that, about the way that the people behaved after the sinking. But yeah, people wouldn't talk about it because they physically couldn't. I mean, there are, I want to say, 8 linked suicides to the sinking. There's one instance where someone was from Detroit and they used to love to go to Tigers games, and now they couldn't because the cheer of the stadium would send them flashbacks to waiting and hearing people scream while they froze to death.
Well, I'm a Tigers fan, so that strikes me as a very deep tragedy. I really didn't know about that. And out of all the people who were on the ship, how many survived again?
I've seen 705 and 708.
With there not being enough lifeboats, we talked before about how they didn't want to clutter the deck. But they do put people on the lifeboats. But in the movie, it's also referenced that they didn't fill the lifeboats as much as they could have. Is that true?
Definitely.
By the records?
Yep. So you kind of see that bit where Rose's mom is like, well, I wouldn't want it to get too crowded. Like, are these going to be sorted by class? And it seems ridiculous in that moment. But at first, they weren't filling the lifeboats a lot because they were treating it more as like a test. Oh, we'll get everyone off and then we'll bring them back on. And it wasn't this mass panic and the mass hysteria that we see later, because it was unsinkable. The passengers didn't believe it had actually hit an iceberg. The crew didn't believe it actually hit an iceberg. Nobody believed that it was actually sinking until Thomas Andrews went down and did the assessment to realize that yes, the ship was going to sink and in a matter of hours. So when they're sending these first lifeboats off, first of all, nobody was even on deck. They were trying to get people to fill the, hey, you're over here, like I want you to come with me. And nobody wanted to leave the safe big ship to go into these tiny rickety lifeboats.
Yeah.
And then eventually, after the first couple were launched and more of the panic started happening, they still were only filling them about half full because they, part of it was the fear of the actual lifeboats collapsing, even though they'd been tested. Also, it was just kind of a classist thing where we're just going to fill it with, we're going to make it comfortable. We're not going to squeeze people in. We're not going to pack them like sardines. We're going to leave it first class, women and children only.
Even if they had done that, though, let's say they packed all the lifeboats to capacity. Per se, how many more people would have survived potentially?
Like what they talk about in the movie, you're still only looking at about half. So maybe another 300 to 400 people, but you're still only looking at, at most about 1,100.
And with the number of people, because the lifeboats did come back eventually, and how many people did they save when they made that swoop back to?
I want to say less than 10.
Less than 10 people.
So what happened is, when the ship went down, and this was a real fear at the time, and they talk about this in the movie as well, the ship's going down, well, it's going to generate suction because right now it's filling up, but there's still a lot of air within the ship. So when it goes down, it's going to suck all the water into the ship and kind of fill in the air that's being released. So they were worried that if the lifeboats go back, and I'm not sure how real or superficial this kind of fear was, but they were worried that if the lifeboats go back, they're going to be pulled in with the suction. So they were getting as far away as possible. And if they weren't worried about the suction, they were worried about the masses of people just swarming any lifeboat that got too close because they were worried about capsizing and then everyone dying. Again, part of it was classless because most of the people in the lifeboats were first and second class and they didn't want to go back and rescue the third class people. But part of it was just a genuine fear that if we go back, we might die. And so they stayed. By the time the ship was, completely submerged and people felt safe enough to go back, they kind of all swarmed together, moved some people around to make more empty lifeboats because they had so many gaps. So they went back with pretty empty lifeboats to go get, people that had survived the sinking in the water. But by the time that happened, most of the people had already died of hypothermia. So they had only been able to recover about 10 people as a result of waiting so long.
And with the whole shipwreck, obviously we have the actual historical event and then there was the movie and then the Broadway show. Is there anything that these adaptions or people's perceptions of it that you think a lot of people have misconstrued, or a false rumor that has kind of gone around that throughout your research you've seen, okay, a lot of people think this, but actually...
Well, I guess if you're looking at it in the time of the wreck, there was this really big stigma to be a man and survive. Not so much like a boy, because women and children, but if you were, greater than 17, there was this horrible stigma that you were weak and that you were selfish and that, the women and children should have been put in the lifeboat before you.
Yeah.
So that's something really interesting to kind of analyze is the gendered priorities of who should survive the sinking.
Right, because they all say, okay, women and children, only women
Yep.
and children. So was that a real thing when they were taking people on?
Oh yeah, that
then?
was the consensus for most shipwrecks. I mean, I want to say even far beyond, past the Titanic, just because it was the gentlemanly thing to do. So that's kind of a big thing looking at it from a historical context. But I think just kind of studying the wreck itself, I mean, there's been numerous dives to it. There have been some people that just go down and their entire goal is just to kind of treasure hunt and see what they can find. There's arguments over who owns the wreck because it is in international waters.
Right. So, and they've taken so much from the wreck because you've been to how many of the museums?
A couple.
And so they have a lot of these artifacts that they have brought up. And they just claim those and put them in the museums. Is there anything else really down there? I mean, have we kind of stripped it of a lot of the
there's a lot. So if you're kind of even looking at this picture that we have, this is only about half, maybe a little bit more toward the back, but you're only looking at about half the ship. That's even above the sand line.
So there's a whole other part of the ship that's just below in the sand now that they don't really...
They can't even access to it. So, part of the issue is by the time that Robert Ballard and his crew discovered Titanic, and I want to say 1985, it had just decayed to about this level. I mean, it's 2.5 miles under the ocean. It's under immense pressure. There's no light. There's little sea critters, and you'll kind of see what they call rusticles, which look like icicles, but it's just
hanging down.
Yeah.
It just looks very
You see a lot of that in the
eerie
movie, yeah.
looking.
And so because of that, it's just a really, especially the stern, so the back half of the wreck is just a mangled mess. There's not really much exploration that can be done because the ship itself is just so twisted. It's really weak. It could collapse. And there's just a really big safety thing that you just can't go exploring into some of those really vulnerable areas of the ship. So while a lot of it has been searched and analyzed and documented, pictures, videos, there's a lot left that hasn't been seen yet and probably will never will be.
And that's a fascinating part of it too, is, I mean, like we mentioned before, this wreck is over 100 years old, and it spawned so many books and movies and everything about it.
Yeah.
So what lessons do you think have impacted us the most?
You can't control fate. You can't control the outcome because, nature will always win. So here we have this unsinkable ship. It's got the watertight bulkheads. It's got the double hull. It's got, stories and stories of opportunities, and, from the poorest people to some of the richest people in the world. And in the end, they're all dying.
Right. And it's, you can't escape it. Doesn't matter what class you are. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. And like I said, since Valentine's Day was, what was that, last week? Last week. Yeah. So this movie was on a lot. And it just got me thinking about all the questions that resurfaced from the time that I first thought about, like, how frustrated I was about just the time period, but also like the love story, was Jack just a player and he like wasn't going to stay with Rose once they got out, or like how did she, reinvent herself? And I'd always be the kind of kid, I would watch these movies and be like, I hope they make a sequel so I can see what happens to her, what she did after she got off the ship. Because I was just like, always wondering about that. But did you ever want them to make another? I mean, was there ever discussions to make like a Titanic 2? I know they made the Ghosts of the Abyss documentary.
Yeah.
That was like James Cameron, right? Or
I don't know if that one was, but there's one that so he did direct a documentary. Basically, his documentary was a critique of his own movie. So he took all of these experts and really analyzed, scientifically, historically, from eyewitness accounts to just the numbers and the data process through the building, through the execution, through trials and court documents, and critiqued his own movie. And I think for me, it was never, he talks about it as he found out that they were making this billion-dollar movie, and why are you making something we know how it ends? And his whole goal was, that's the point. You know how it ends.
Yeah.
And it's the story that I'm going to get you to that ending that's going to really make the difference and make this movie the historical icon that it's become.
Do you feel like that this is a movie that you would show your kids and grandkids, and you're going to tell them about the Titanic and, after all this time? Like, do you think that it'll still have an impact on generations to come?
I think the impact will slowly start to fade. I think, the interesting thing is that you and I were born the year that the movie came out, and the movie only came out about 12 years after the wreck itself was found. So there was this whole new ignition. I mean, that's why I think people our age are so fascinated with it, because
it was a phenomenon.
It was this, it had kind of been forgotten about for so many years, and then they rediscovered it. And moving forward, it was just this, once it was rediscovered, it generated another 20 years of discussion and analysis and studies and documentaries. But eventually it's going to collapse, and eventually people aren't going to be able to study it anymore, and eventually it's just going to kind of turn more into history than an event that we can continue to make relevant.
Well, I very much enjoyed talking to you about what we've learned today and everything, and how the historical event itself and the movies impacted us years and years later. And I'm sure we'll watch this movie again sometime.
Oh yeah, I have no doubt.
I
Thank
have
you
no
for letting me live my life stream to be the expert witness.
It's been my pleasure. So for all my classmates watching who thought that I wouldn't have this discussion, or who thought I was crazy for saying in class one day, do you guys ever think about how the Titanic is still down there? I made this for you. So thank you again, Josie.
Thank you.
But looking forward to having you on the show again sometime for watching the movie again. I'm not Oprah yet, but I'm getting there.